Hi everyone, welcome to this second video of our webinar series, Fiscal Policy for a Sustainable Future. If you haven't watched the first one was about everything you need to know to understand what fiscal policy is and why it matters for the climate debate. So go check it out. The link is in the description. And now you should even be able to see us. Wow! This is webinar 2 of a series of 3. And the last webinar was about really all the basics of fiscal policy and why it matters right now in the policy debate. So we'll go quickly through this so that everybody's at the same level so that we can go through all this. And then we'll get into the depth of our topic, which is what is the funding gap for the climate transition? How much money do we need? What do we need it for? Where can this money come from? And why does this have an impact on the debt situation of countries in Europe? And then we'll move into more policy topics. So the fiscal policy framework of the European Union is being reformed right now. So what was wrong with it, what's happening now. We'll keep you posted on all this and suggest a few ways forward, basically progressive ideas to reform this, and yeah, we'll go through that, and then we'll conclude. It's quite a densely packed agenda, but we'll try to also take questions and comments as they go. If that's fine with everyone, let's jump into the quick summary of the first webinar, and I think that's for you, Katja.
Yes. So what did we do last time? So the first thing that is we actually defined fiscal policy, because even, I also had it a few years ago that I was thinking, okay, everyone talks about fiscal policy, but what does it even mean? I think the word can also be a bit confusing. So fiscal policy is basically one part of economic policy that the government can do. And so above you actually see all the other kind of areas that consist or that make economic policy of governments. So welfare, inflation, unemployment, public services, healthcare, etc., but also climate action. And then we have fiscal and monetary policy. So fiscal policy is basically about how do we spend money, do we borrow money, and how do we tax? Because in the end, if we spend, we also want to have some revenues, right? So if people talk about EU revenues, it's basically EU taxes such as the carbon adjustment border mechanism. I think some CBM in short. And then on the other side, we also have the monetary policy. So this is about managing the money supply and the interest rates. So this is all, the mandate lies mainly with the European Central Bank. And this webinar is focused really on fiscal policy, but of course fiscal and monetary policies are highly interlinked. And this is also a very common demand now that we have, or that also our allies have, that, okay, this should be better coordinated, and maybe also the ECB should have different mandates when it comes to climate action.
The ECB being the European Central Bank.
The European Central Bank. And then we talked about, we live in times of crisis. It's not news for anyone here. And to effectively tackle the climate crisis, we do need a lot of money. And then the EU alone, the green funding gap, so that means like all the investments that we would need to tackle climate, but also transition to a more sustainable economy, is estimated to be 855 billion per year, and that excludes transport, and that excludes also all the other social investments that we probably need for a just transition. Then we might wonder, okay, could companies pay for that? And here we have studies, but Thomas will also dig into it a bit later, that 60% of the investments actually don't have a business case. So that means a business doesn't have any incentive to actually do that investments, because the return of investment is probably lower than what they would get out of this. So the bottom line was it costs a lot, but there was also a thing called the fiscal multiplier. It's basically saying if the government invests €1, it actually more money will trickle down to the economy. So it's actually it doesn't really crowd out the private investments. It actually is good for the economy.
Oh, Thanks, Kati. And right, we didn't forget anything. Yeah. So that's my favorite meme, and also it's for me a way to introduce a bit the discussion that we're going to be having now, because as we talk about money, public money, climate transition, climate investments, future generations, and I as an advocate for young people, I hear a lot. Oh, but like why are you advocating for more debt? Debt is a burden on future generations, and I think if we work this topic together, it will bring a lot of insights on what public debt is, how it's needed for climate action, and what future generations have to do with all this. So indulge me, and let's break the public debt is an unfair burden on future generations myth together. The first thing to talk about is that public debt is not private debt. It doesn't work at all as private debt, as a household's debt. It's not something that we completely inherit, and it has investment in front of it. So when a government will go, I don't know, 1 million euros in debt, but it's buying or building a school, then it has a school as well. So it balances itself. Then we have, but that's something I think we went through in webinar 1 quite thoroughly. And then we have the whole unfair burden thing. And I'm going to be breaking that down quickly, but does it have to be a burden, this public debt? Does it have to be unfair? And we'll see quickly if it's technical or political to actually call this a burden. And then, of course, there's the future generations topic. Who are we talking about? Who are future generations? Have they been consulted? Have we been consulted? What exactly is the youth and the future generations demanding? So let's go through that quickly. Public debt. Public debt is very different. So as I was saying, from a household's debt, we have the fiscal multiplier thing. So if you don't know or don't remember what that is, the video of the webinar 1 is on YouTube. We edited it, so it's only an hour long, and it's quite an easy way to go through it. And I think more importantly, governments, need to spend money now to prepare for the future. And today we know and that there is a funding gap. Governments in Europe, they're not spending the money that they should be spending to invest in the infrastructure that we need for a climate neutral future. But we'll be coming back to this later because that's the whole topic of this webinar. And the other thing is that investing now will cost less than failing to invest now and having to spend money tomorrow because we have to face the impacts of climate change. So that's a very, very important part of what needs to be understood today, I think. It's that there's a cost of failure. There's a cost of inaction that is absolutely immense. And I'm only talking about the money side of it, right? It's going to cost us more if we don't prepare for climate change now and mitigate climate change now, or the climate crisis, sorry. So I'm only talking about money, not about, all the impacts on lives, on livelihoods, on, our societies as we know them, etc. It's going to cost us more.
And we were laughing because we're trying to say climate crisis instead of climate change, because it's a crisis in the end, and change sounds a bit neutral.
And so, yes, on the public debt thing, we have the fact that, so if the investment that we need today is not funded by states, who will it be funded by? But we'll be coming back to that, because we know, and we have quite a substantial proof that most of the investments that we need to mitigate the climate crisis and to avoid going over 1.5 degrees in global warming, most of these investments are not profitable and will not be led by the by the private sector, but I promise I'll be going through this thoroughly in like 15 minutes. And then I'd like to talk quickly about this idea that public debt would be an unfair burden on future generations, because this one I really never really understand, because the unfair burden that we're going to be carrying, that we're already carrying, is the extreme droughts and heat waves that we see, the deadly floods that we already see and that are going to multiply, the collapse in ecosystems and the loss of biodiversity, conflicts that are going to emerge over access to water. And this is just examples of the unfair burden on our generations that comes from previous generations, if I may. So I think tackling these issues is the right thing to do, rather than, just calling this a burden. And I'm not the only one who thinks that, which is great. The vice president of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, said that very recently in 2021, that if we don't solve the climate crisis now, we will be fighting wars over water and food. It's a kind of catastrophist way of saying what I was saying earlier, but yeah, I mean, it's common knowledge also in the European Commission. And then there's the topic on, should it be a burden? Because it's a political choice to finance the investments that we need with debt. We could also finance it with taxes. We are deliberately deciding to put this on young people, on future generations, because the generations that are in power right now and that have access to most of the wealth are refusing to bear the burden themselves. And that's why we'll be talking also about progressive taxation, and we'll be coming back to this a bit later. And then quickly, when we usually hear public debt is an unfair burden on future generations, it's not young people who are saying that. And I mean, as a policy officer at the Youth Forum, I have to ask, we're here, the future generations. Have you considered consulting us? And do you really believe that it's unfair to invest in the things we care about? Education, training, research, social and economic infrastructures that we're going to need and that we already need, industrial and innovation policies for net zero future. And yeah, please consult us. Have you heard about, Fridays for Future, global climate strikes, or there's a bit of advertising for our members, Generation Climate Europe, Youth and Environment Europe, International Young Nature Friends. I mean, all these young people are there, and it would be worth it to actually listen to us. So when you actually do listen to young people and you ask them, what is the most serious problem facing the world as a whole? In Europe, 23 European countries, 15 to 35 years old. Well, they answer climate change and environmental degradation. And of course, spread of infectious diseases, because this was done in February 2021. But I don't even know what to say. So to say it, to wrap it up, public debt is not an unfair burden on future generation. What is an unfair burden on future generation is not investing in their future and not taking the action that is needed now. So let's get to what this action should be.
Yeah, so now we dive a bit into what is actually the green funding gap, where can the money come from, and also having a look a bit on the debt situation, the public debt situation of the member states right now.
And Katya, just to keep you updated, we are a bit in advance. So we have 10 minutes of buffer.
Okay, yeah. Great. Also, again, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat. Last time it actually also worked quite well that we even tried to answer them on the go.
Yeah. I'll be taking a look at the chat and everything.
Yes. So what are the investments needs? We also already touched upon this in our first webinar.
I mean, the economies that we have now are not really built to actually mitigate or adapt to climate change. And then it's also the climate crisis. And it's also not just a climate crisis, right? We also we are facing a biodiversity crisis. There's an increasing inequalities in Europe. I mean, yeah. I think the new word is triple crisis or multiple crisis. I mean, every year there's a new word for the crisis that we face. I mean, on top of this, also now we are highly dependent on fossil fuel energies. So this all means we need a lot of investments to actually make our economies ready for what is coming. And what we, as I said before, the 855 billion euros is the green funding gap at the moment. And this basically means that the member states at the moment are highly off track to reach the 1.5 Paris agreements or the climate objectives. And that's also been said again and again. If you don't invest now, the goal will even be more far away. And also more spending efforts will be needed that we actually reach our environmental and climate objectives. And I think here it's also important to start investing now because, I mean, as a German, I see already with the train, I mean, the infrastructure has been underfunded for years. And now there is some funding going on, but it also, of course, takes time and also has implications for the infrastructure to build. So now we have a lot of delays with the train, for example. Another thing are heat pumps. I think now heat pumps becoming a bit of thing that you should install in your house, but then it also takes time to produce these heat pumps. And this is then also related to the critical raw materials that we need. By the way, there's also an ongoing EU file on the critical raw materials. So this all needs time and it should really, be started now and not tomorrow. And EU funds can actually be an effective tool that we in Europe or the member states actually manage to meet an EU environment, or close the green investment gap. And it's also a bit what Thomas already said in the beginning. We have different options like taxations, funds, borrowing, but then, I will also talk about this later, but as in Europe also, mostly the member states are responsible for taxes. There are also certain difficulties, whereas EU funds, are a good option, and for all the reasons also Thomas said before. So what are the investment needs? So one issue is that it's really difficult actually to find good numbers and also a bit of an overview of what is actually needed. So one of our demands is also, we need like a method to actually assess the green investment gap for all member states, but also for the Europe as a whole. And I think this, I can safely say that also goes for other countries in Europe, outside of Europe. But here, this is actually from the Commission staff working document. So you can already see the number is lower because they're always a bit more cautious with what we need funding wise. But I found it quite interesting because here we just wanted to show you a little bit. And again, it actually excludes the social investments that we need, but another 465 billion per year will be necessary to reach the climate environmental objectives that we also agreed on it. We should also not forget this. I mean, we signed the Paris Agreement. And then on the left-hand side, you see, for example, alone 30 billion for renewable energies. And I think this is also from 2020. So probably it's even higher now with the pressure with the war in Ukraine. Construction, I mean, we actually need a huge amount of money just to renovate our buildings because of a lot of the buildings in Europe are not really fit for the winters or summers, etc. And I think we also really missed the opportunities in the past years whenever there was a new building that is actually already been built to environmental conditions that we would actually need. So that's why this number is really, really high. And there also, for EU policy nerds, there were some, I think, an agreement in the parliament on the building efficiency directive. So if anyone is interested, and I'm happy to connect to my colleagues. Transport is also a huge area. I think this number might be also even too slow if we think about how our infrastructure in most of our countries are really built on individualized modes of transport, meaning the car, and also in our cities and Brussels. I mean, Brussels is really made for cars, whereas what we would need is more public transport, 15-minute city so that you can reach everything while walking 15 minutes. I mean, yeah, a lot needs to be done because it just has been underinvested in the past years. And then other areas mentioned here is also environmental protection. So you probably also saw that we are in an area of extinction. So a lot of the species that we have are becoming extinct. It's also really related to our unsustainable farming practices. So also, again, like for farming and biodiversity and afforestation, we will need a lot of money. And closely connected to this is also the research management. So how do we get the water back on track? And yeah, flora and fauna is also connected to biodiversity, I would argue. And then also, how do we make our economies more circular? I also found it very interesting. I mean, we always talk about circular economy, but at the moment, the world is only 9% circular, actually. So that's really, really far away from what we need. And there are very different issues related to this. So yeah, just to give you a bit of an idea what are the investments that we would need.
And then I guess I'll jump to my case study, because what we wanted to do now is to take one scenario that we think is realistic for Europe, a scenario that brings the European economy to net zero emissions in 2050. So net zero emissions means if there still are some emissions of greenhouse gases, they are compensated by carbon recapture, whether the recapture of carbon comes from forests or other, how do they call it? Nature-based solutions?
Yes, that's what they call it.
Or from new technologies that we don't have yet. As you'll see, actually, in this scenario, there's almost zero carbon recapture from technological means. It's basically forests. So it's a scenario that has been designed by the consulting firm McKinsey in 2020. It's a very good, very comprehensive study, and we're going to be working with this for the next 10 to 15 minutes. I think it's a very interesting study for a few reasons. The first one is that it's comprehensive. The second, that it really studies how to finance the scenario, which sectors need to transition when, how do we finance those transitions, etc. So we're going to be going through that and trying to understand what money is needed and where from. Just before I jump into that, I saw there's someone who wrote in the chat, and I wonder if it was a question. Let's do it
now.
I don't think it's a question. So
yeah, but it's a relevant comment, saying basically, okay, we have our own obligations, but then of course we are also historically responsible for most of the emissions. So we also do have an obligation to contribute to climate finance internationally.
For sure. And there's tons of debates going on loss and damage and things like that, that are absolutely relevant. So yeah, as per usual, actually, we're going to be talking about the public investments needed in Europe to finance the transition. So that's only a small part, sadly, of all the things that need to happen. But one webinar at a time, we'll maybe get to everything that we need.
Yes, but thanks for highlighting it, for the comments. They're very appreciated.
So this path that we could be following, it's one of the scenarios that we could follow, but we think it's a realistic one. That's neither too optimistic nor too pessimistic.
Non me la sento più, mamma.
So let's get
wait, I can
yeah, let's see. Anyways, let's get to it. So for the first, let's read that graph on the left. If you take a look, it starts in 1990, and you have the whole amount is the emissions of greenhouse gases in the European Union. So and sector by sector, right? So the black part is production of electricity, power. Then the light blue is transportation. Then dark blue, buildings. Then I don't know, is that green? Yeah, light green, the industry, and darker green is the agriculture. And then you have a negative part, which is this crazy acronym that you might have seen somewhere else, LULUCF. So that's land use change, and forestry. It's a negative because if you transform, if you build a forest,
afforestation,
reforestation and things like that have a positive impact. So they reduce emissions. And then the little purple one in between 2045 and 2050 is emission absorption technology. So let's just not even go there. But what's the most important to understand here is one, that emissions have already started going down in the European Union, but that the pace really needs to accelerate if we want to reach the targets that were agreed upon in Paris in 2021. And the second thing that's really important is that what we need to begin with, what we need to start to decarbonize is electricity, power production, right? Because so many other sectors rely on this. And so that's what we need to start with. And that's why my second slide focuses on electrification. The thing, if you read this study, is they say, and that the demand for electricity basically is going to double in the next 10 years as all the other sectors switch to electrification. And so we need to be doing both things at the same time. So electrification and turning our power production to a carbon neutral power. So that's wind and solar. So what's really interesting is that if you look for the next 10 years, almost half of the reduction of emissions that we need come from this, just the production of electricity. But these changes, they're going to need huge investments because power plants are expensive, basically. And we know that it's not going to be led by the private sector. How do we know that? Because it hasn't been led by the private sector for the past 100 years. So wind and solar power generation needs investment, and this investment needs to come from states or public organizations, right? And the other important and interesting thing to note is that wind and solar power generation, the technologies, they're already available. We do need to do some research, but we already have technologies that are available at scale. And I think I see a point in the chat about geothermal. I don't have anything against geothermal, and I think it's included in these graphs. But what we are saying right now is we already have some technologies that are available, that are scalable. Let's focus on that for the moment, while we can also prepare for the future with geothermal and green hydrogen.
Focus on green hydrogen.
Yes.
Because I think there are also increasingly efforts on the EU level to green energy sources that are not green, or that we wouldn't consider green.
Yeah, and in order to do this transition and to create the infrastructure, build the infrastructure that we need, the required investments are absolutely gigantic. So according to this study that we trust, reaching net zero would require, I don't even know, 28 trillion euros in investments over the next 30 years. So that's around 800 billion euros a year. So 800,000 millions. That would come from redirected investments that fund today carbon intensive technologies. And that's, so just to give you an idea, it's about 25% of all the capital investments that are made every year in the European Union today. It's around 4% of the gross domestic product, the GDP of the EU. So it's doable, but it's a very big effort, and it's a very big effort. Then if you want to go a bit deeper into the study, they break it down into into decades, and in the investments that are needed right now and the ones that will be needed in 10 years and in 20. And I think that's where we come back to this topic that there's some things that need to be done right now, which, for instance, the power grid and the production of electricity really needs to happen now, because so many other transitions depend on our ability to produce carbon neutral electricity. And that's why sometimes we're so worried, right? It's because we don't see these investments happening right now. We are, we're worried because we're like, oh, but if we take 10 years, if we're 10 years late on this, none of this works anymore, right? And we won't reach our targets.
Yeah, and I think just like to add also from our perspective, I think we also need a general reduction in demand, because as we are overconsume and overproduce, I mean, it's also not done with just greening our electricity grid. It's also, it comes also with a change of our economic system.
And I'm almost done with the case study, and when that will be done, I see there's questions in the chat, and we can go through them together. But as I was saying, there's this 28,000 billion euros that are needed in investments in clean technologies and techniques over the next 30 years. And half of them, more than half of them actually, about half of them, of these investments, they're not profitable. They don't have what McKinsey calls positive investment cases or a business case. They're just not profitable. And among those investments that are needed in the next 10 years, only 40% of them are profitable. And I mean, that's the really important thing to understand. It's that's how, free market economies work. If it's not profitable, there's absolutely no reason for anybody to invest in these, in the infrastructure, in what Kati was describing earlier. And so if they're not profitable enough, but they're required, right? If we don't do them, then we go to global warming at 2 degrees or 2.5 or even worse. And we know that that's not an option. So what do we do? And this is where public intervention comes in, right? There is a few options, but one of the main options is to actually do the financing and do the investing ourselves. And so to close the gaps and to go through direct public financing, and that's estimated to 5 trillion of the 28 trillion that we were talking about. And then there's other options, but we're going to be going through these a bit more in depth. But there's price measures like the carbon prices or cap and trade systems, or the emission trading scheme in the European Union, where but emission trading schemes, carbon prices, cap and trade systems, all of these require public financing as well, because if you have a carbon price at 100 euros a ton or even at 50 euros a ton, then you need mechanism to compensate for lower income households that will have higher energy bills. So it's in any case, you need states to come in. And then another option is de-risking and bringing in long-term investors and supporting these investors. But that's, again, mobilizing private capital using public money to protect back securities and make it safer. So this slide says the necessary investments aren't profitable enough, but they are still required. So what do we do? And it kind of answers while we do it ourselves, the public sector needs to come in. And before going to questions, I just want to come in with another study that says, okay, it's another study from the Office budget for the UK budget for UK Office for Budget Responsibility that basically studies UK budgets, United Kingdom budgets. And they published a study last year, in 2021, that measures the impact on public debt, so on the debt of the United Kingdom, of not doing anything and not investing at all in climate change and in climate action, sorry. And that's what they call the late action scenario. If you look at this graph says what would be the impact on the net debt of the public sector of different scenarios of climate change mitigation. And the early action scenario is the one in the middle, and it would increase the public debt by something like 35%. And not doing anything, which they call the late action scenario, because they say in the end you're going to need to act anyways because you're going to have droughts, floods, fires, etc. So you're going to be spending a lot of money to actually adapt to climate change. That in that case, it's more like 57%. So the tricky part is that not acting today costs much more than acting now and taking the measures that we really need. Should we take a second to answer questions? I see the chat is very active.
Yes, I mean I think the whole chapter is still like 2 slides, but maybe we can yeah, so maybe we can just finish this. Okay, I mean, from all what you've heard, we also wanted to show you, okay, what is actually now the public debt situation in Europe. And as we also said last time, we have the EU fiscal rules with the debt and deficit rules of 6%. I mean, a member state cannot go beyond 60% of public debt of GDP, and also 3% of their structural deficit. And of course, due to the recent crises, but also COVID and the energy crisis, you can see here now where the member states stand. And there are actually there are only a few countries who actually are in line with the debt and deficit rules. And so what that means for the fiscal rules, we will explain in a minute. And also coming back to myth, I think we also found that was also very interesting. So the kind of 60% debt to GDP criteria, they're kind of arbitrary. So there's no scientific assessment why this has been chosen. So it's also a myth that this is called sustainable public debt, because on the left side, you see very different countries and their debt to GDP ratio. And for Japan, for example, it's like over 250%. But still, I mean, they're a healthy operating country. So you can say it's not that they're like close to default. So it's actually not true that only if your debt is below 60%, your public debt is sustainable. It depends on various different factors. And so the quick question is, would we actually live in a more sustainable world if you look on the right side, if everyone has just like 60%? And we will come to the answer also in a second, which is no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before doing our check-in, should we go through questions?
Because we have 10 minutes actually for questions.
Yeah. So I'll just read the question.
Yes.
So if we start with Anne's question, how about geothermal for buildings and hydrogen as sources of energy? I think we said we answered on a bit on the geothermal part. Just want to remind that hydrogen has never been and will never be a source of energy. Sadly, it's a way to store energy, but It's not something that we find in nature. So we produce hydrogen with energy, and then we produce energy with hydrogen. So it's just a way to store it, and that's why we call green hydrogen, because you can produce hydrogen batteries with fossil fuels, and that we call brown hydrogen. And so it's very important when we talk about hydrogen to consider it, one, as a energy storage technology, and two, to make sure that we're talking about energy storage mechanisms that are green.
And also, I think we're still very far away of actually producing it. Not even talking about green hydrogen. So I think we also, or we as EB, say we need to be also careful to rely on techniques that are actually not mature. Well, as Thomas said, also, I mean, solar and wind. I mean, we have also other sources that are already proven and that are also very profitable at the moment, or like became profitable and cheaper. And if someone also is interested in this, and our EB website, and under the climate and energy team, you also have our, I think that's the green hydrogen position paper on what we think about that.
And I see Remy in the chat is putting figures in on green hydrogen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Then we have a question on our opinion. So let's see. Do you see Europe with its resources as being one of the forerunners of green investments as compared to other global regions in the years leading up to 2030? I'll try. I mean, I don't know if we will be, as Europeans, forerunners of green investments, but what we're trying to do here is to ensure that we are, or at least that Europe does its part in this challenge, in being up to the challenge.
Yeah, I think we also missed a bit our opportunity. So just from the German experience, we did have a solar industry, which was kind of destroyed due to incentives to not invest in solar, but maybe go for cheap Russian gas. And I think there are now increasingly discussions again on the EU level. Okay, how can we like rebuild our industry? But then I think one also has to be honest that the solar industry is probably much more profitable now in China or in the United States. So the question is if it will ever, if the EU, for example, will ever be again front runner in solar. But I think there are also other sources, like for example, wind, where there's a lot of like expertise and technology and knowledge here. So I think we should really now, build the right regulatory framework that this can like thrive and not hold it back.
Thanks, Kati. Then I have a hard one. I have no idea how to answer that question, but which European country would you say is the best aligned with the EU's goals related to renewable energy? Do you know that?
No, that would be interesting to see the renewable energy mixes. I could imagine like Norway or Sweden, because they have a lot of hydropower.
Let's say Sweden then, but we can take a look and answer separately.
Yeah.
And Pietro Cesaro was asking, is it split across sectors, the non-profitability thing? Yes, it is. We'll send along in the email after this the link directly to the study. You can take a look. It's really, really well done. And yes, it's split across everything, sectors, countries. There's a technical annex that's appendix that's a lot of fun for nerds like me, for instance. Then we have Jogo, who is asking, where does nuclear power fall in this net zero path? I don't know. We'll have to check. But again, we can take a look at the study a bit deeper. Okay, that's not a question. That's not a question, but there are really interesting comments. Oh, and there's actually a whole discussion going on.
So we also invite everyone else to check each other's comments.
And Marco was asking, is the funding gap measured in the context of future continuous growth? How will it fare in a degrowth scenario?
Yeah, I mean, this is also a very interesting question, because I think it's also something that we deal with it a lot. I mean, Yeah, so from like the classical kind of research centers, they do, I mean, GDP growth is one of the like kind of indicators they use for their predictions. But then what we also, for example, try to also say, look, there are also investments that we need that don't necessarily grow so much, but they're still necessary. And we will come back to this later, but that's why we say we should focus on resilience enhancing investments. So this should be like one of the main criteria why we should do an investment, and not because it kind of enhances growth.
Yeah, but just then to answer directly the question, yes, this scenario that we case studied is a growth scenario.
Yes, sorry, could have deviated from
the
question.
But the topic is endless.
Yes.
Where does agriculture and food fall in this net zero path? It does. Let me see if I can get us back to the slide quickly.
I saw agriculture somewhere. Yeah.
If you take a look, I don't think it reduces a lot of its emissions in this scenario here, but it's also not one of the biggest emitters, is it? For now. So that's where it stands. But the LULUCF, I still don't know how to pronounce it, but the LULUC, land use change and forestry part, is definitely linked to agricultural practices and policies as well. So I guess the idea is to reduce a bit of the emissions in agriculture, but also land use change would cover the rest of the gap or something like that.
And I think my agriculture colleagues would probably also argue, I mean, it's also one thing to look at emissions, but then also the farming model that we have now has like huge environmental impacts. It's just not about emissions. So it's also about chemicals and soils and food quality, etc. So I think they would also say this is probably also underestimated here. I mean, in the end, it's also McKinsey.
It is
doing this study.
But that's also why I like this one, because it's neither too optimistic nor too pessimistic. It's sadly realistic, and that's why I like working with this one. And
yeah,
it's one of the scenarios. Of course, there are other ones, other ways of going to net zero, and that's, I think, why we see the chat talking about degrowth, because it's another way to get to net zero. It's actually reducing emissions rather. So there are tons of different options, but I think this one is kind of a status quo economic system where we would still move towards net zero emissions.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, for example, if they account for that we need more regenerative agriculture practices. That probably also means way smaller farms and things like this.
And right, like the last question that there is do you believe degrowth works, and why? I mean, some of us believe that it works, some of us don't. But can we get into this today? I don't think so. It's too big a topic, but go ahead, Katja.
No, but I think also one quick question is also like, what do we even mean by degrowth? But like as the economic transition team and as of the EB, we do believe that we need to change the economic system, and it also means to drastically reduce our consumption and production, because we also produce a lot of stuff that we actually don't need. We are also dependent on GDP growth when we think about the way we work, for example, or the way the taxes are being structured. So, in a nutshell, we do believe it is necessary and it can also work, but it requires a lot of investments in infrastructure that would work, awareness raising, political will. So there's not one size fits all solution. It's a big package. So we can also maybe shamelessly promote our report that we did with the youth farm on escaping the growth and jobs treadmill. So this also explains a little bit like why our jobs depend on GDP growth and how we can break it.
No, I went to get this report because, so to say a few things. One, we're working on this topic of degrowth, and we And so there's this report that we actually wrote together, the European Environment Bureau and the European Youth Forum, that explores some options that we're going to be talking about later as well. And to say that the growth and GDP topic is growing, I think, in the European sphere, and European institutions are starting to actually consider the issue. There is going to be a big conference in the European Parliament in May. It's the Beyond Growth Conference. But we'll be presenting that a tiny bit later as well, just so that you know, like, we are working on it, and we're happy to find friends, allies, and challenges on this.
And people call it very differently. So the European institutions would never say degrowth, so they would rather use post-growth. But I mean, in the end, we want an economy that is geared towards social, environmental, and economic goals, and not just one. And now we want to come back a little bit again to the EU fiscal framework. So this is basically just a bit of a recap. What's wrong with it? Where are we now? There were a few things happen also between now and the last webinar that we had. And then we will end with the exciting part, like ways forward. Okay, I mean, this is also, I mean, we've been talking about this before, but basically, I already said before, the EU fiscal rules is a set of rules that member states have to oblige to. And why do we have them? We have them because partage? No, we share a currency. Sorry, no, the French word came to my mind. So this is also to say, of course, fiscal sustainability is also important because it can have actually quite bad consequences to all of our economies. But what we've seen with so that's the starting point. And then what did EU leaders do? They came up with the 60 and 3% debt and deficit rules, and they thought it's a good idea. Again, it's not based on any economic assessment or something, but they did enshrine it into the treaty. So that's basically the treaty of the functioning of the EU, which is also very hard to change because you need the go from everyone. And I also showed you before the kind of public debt situation of countries. So going actually back to these rules, it will be anyways very, very hard for a lot of member states considering their debt levels now. So we talked about this last time, but the rules have been unable to react to the economic crisis. So also what we saw after 2008, the financial crisis, that it actually forced a lot of member states to even cut spending, which here on the right side, you see the unemployment rates in the EU. So this kind of cutting, or also called austerity measures that were imposed on the member states, led to high unemployment rates all over Europe, but especially in Southern Europe. So we also then now have this southern-northern divide. It also led to the cut of the healthcare sector, for example. I mean, these are the things where people like to cut first. And this, I think, many countries could also feel during the COVID, because then, we didn't have enough capacity to deal with this. I mean, I hope it was also clear that fiscal rules are not unfit to tackle today's challenges, because the debt and deficit rules kind of limit member states to spend more or to fill the green investment gap. The fiscal rules don't really care about the quality of spending. So if you spend it on, I don't know, a Trump hotel, kind of bad example, or on biodiversity or on renewable energies, they don't really make a difference. And then the last point is also that it can actually even harm the stability in the EU, because there are also studies, I also found this super interesting, but that show that austerity measures actually have a positive correlation with anti-EU populism or sentiments. Yes, so I mean, I kind of, I also don't want to go into detail on this again, but As I said, the debt and deficit rules are enshrined in the treaty, also in primary legislation. So this is something, again, really hard to change. But then there have been several legislations called secondary legislation. So you see like the kind of donut around the yellow one, which basically detail how do we implement what's enshrined in the treaty. So we have the preventive arm, the corrective arm. So the preventive arm are all policies that should prevent member states to even overshooting the debt and deficit rules. And then you have the corrective arm, for example, which are all kind of measures that are implemented. So if a member state breached the rules, so how do we get them on the right course in their kind of opinion. And this is all part of the Stability and Growth Pact. And the Stability and Growth Pact also has been revised several times, especially in the aftermath of the financial crisis 2008. So basically the 6-pack and the 2-pack regulation.
And just before we jump to the next slide, I think what's important to understand with this is that primary legislation, so the treaties, as you were saying, are very, very difficult to change and not really up for reform right now. However, all this secondary legislation, preventive arm, corrective arm, are more open for reform. And that's what the policy process is about right now. There's discussions and debates that Katja is going to be developing.
Exactly. And this, I mean, also really don't want to go into detail here, but I think it's if you have some time, you can basically see all the different regulations that happened since the Maastricht criteria were implemented in 1993. And I think what's also important to understand, because there have been so many changes and because it's this big donut, the whole architecture is actually really, really, really complex. And this was also one of the big criticisms of the framework right now. Like, how can we also simplify this whole thing? And as Thomas said, so some of the criticism has also been acknowledged by the Commission. So like I said, the simplification or that actually austerity measures were very bad for a lot of member states. So that's why the Commission reopened a reform process already in 2021. What they usually do, or what's the normal legislative process, is then they open a public consultation. That means that organizations, etc., can hand in their reform proposals. So in that case, it was a set of 8 questions. Even private people like you, technically, you could also answer these questions and then hand it in. This was then put on hold because then COVID came and they had to react to lots of different things. Both European Youth Forum and also the European Environmental Bureau, we are also part of a wider coalition called Fiscal Matters. So together with other organizations, we also do try to align our work and do actions together. So we also really pushed hard that this is coming back on the table. I mean, we do understand there was a certain period where it was difficult, but then because of all of the failures of the reform, we really did a lot of buzz around to reopen the process and to really start this, as also takes time. This was being heard, or I do feel like we had maybe a little bit a part of in this, and then they reopened the discussion again in November 2021. We all handed in our reform proposals. Then a long time passed because in 2022, when it was about to kick off, then the war happened. So again, there was a bit of distraction. But yeah, we are still in, I mean, I will also come to this in the next. And then, yeah, just now I completely didn't talk about what you can see here. But what is also part of the EU fiscal framework architecture is the so-called general escape clause. So this has been activated when COVID started, and it allowed member states to breach the rules because there's a big event, and I mean, economies, the member states had to support the economies with fresh money.
Yeah, and so the general escape clause is still activated.
Yes.
So all the rules that are so complex and not fit for purpose are suspended right now, but basically all member states agreed to set them back to get back to the rules in 2024. So that's also why it's important in the policy process that we kind of have this short time frame to reform the rules before they're back and before we need to follow them again.
Yes, thanks, Thomas.
No worries.
Yeah, so basically here it's just what I said in November 2022. I didn't say it, but what happened in November 2022 was that the Commission presented an orientation paper on what, in their opinion, and after the consultations and talks with member states, a reformed fiscal framework could look like, and I will present this in a minute. And then on 15th and 14th March, the finance ministers met in Brussels, and they adopted a position or a reaction to the orientation paper. And then just last week, the head of states met to discuss all kinds of things. So the fiscal rules were not a big topic on the agenda, but what they did were they endorsed the conclusions from the finance ministers. And this is basically, you can kind of say, a green light now for the Commission to put forward a legislative proposal. They couldn't really do that before. Looking in the European Commission orientation, and we will dive a bit deeper into this in our next and last webinar. But yeah, we just also, as we present some of the solutions, I think it's also good to see a bit what the Commission wants. As it's a very decisive issue, unfortunately, the debt and deficit rules of 60% and 3% remain. And it's also what Thomas already said before. It's really hard to change, so they didn't even touch this. I didn't even propose, okay, yeah, maybe it's good to reopen a treaty change discussion. A second big element are country-specific expenditure pathways based on a debt sustainability analysis. It sounds maybe a bit complicated, but basically, it's going away from a one-size-fits-all solution so that all member states have to reduce the debt in the same way, acknowledging, okay, maybe member states have very different economic situations, economic starting points, etc. So for Italy, the country-specific debt reduction pathway will probably look very different to the German one. That's basically it. And then the method to kind of forecast this country-specific expenditure or debt reduction pathway is a debt sustainability analysis, which is basically just a tool to use or to forecast what it would look like. I mean, here again, maybe if some of you are a bit into discussions, it's also been discussed because, of course, it's a method, an economic method. So this also depends on what kind of indicators you use and could be also object to uncertainty. Another big thing is that, so before they had kind of also arbitrary indicators to kind of, conduct this. And then they would like to use a so-called net primary expenditure rule. It's basically all the total expenditures minus interest rates and unemployment payments, as well as some other additional expenditures. And this should be the only indicator to indicate if member states actually comply with the debt and deficit rules. Another element, a new element, are fiscal structure plans that member states would put forward. So they would kind of write them and then show them to the Commission. And they can also add certain reform investments that could lead to a 3-year extension. So basically, your debt reduction pathway just is a bit prolonged. And then the last important, also big part is still is also from the Commission side that they say, okay, we do have rules, but no one actually cares about them, so no one actually has enforced them. So we really want to have simpler rules, but then also really a focus on strict enforcement and also sanctions, because we did have sanctions before, but they also say, okay, if now a member state is really like breaching it, there should be also measures that they get punished for it. I mean, if you can say it in a very informal way. And then on the right side, you just also see the 3 elements. And it's from Nils Redeker from the Jacques Delors Center. He had a presentation last week, but I think it kind of shows quite nicely the 3 elements. So one is analysis. So how do we analyze the pathways? Then it's about negotiation. So, I mean, the plans can be negotiated, or the Commission can also provide an assessment of the plan, which will then be endorsed by the Council. And then the last important aspect is the implementation. So if we have our fiscal structure plans that were endorsed or will be validated by the Council, like it's also up to the Commission to have an eye on, okay, how is this actually been implemented? Are the member states on track? And if not, in their opinion, we need to implement enforcement measures.
Yeah, thanks, Kati. I'm just mindful of time. It's
Okay.
a bit too. It's 2:12, so maybe we skip a bit to our ways forward.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the next slide is also basically just what the council just endorsed actually what's being said. So you can read this maybe if you get the presentation.
And also in June, we'll be organizing a third webinar to close this series, where we'll be focusing on Commission, Council, Parliament, who thinks what, where is the policy process going for people who want to actually do some advocacy, either in the member states or in Brussels on this topic, and we'll be diving into these exciting EU nerd stuff. I mean, the big, maybe just the big bottom line is that even the orientation, it's still not enough actually to create the fiscal pace that we need, because it's still extremely limited. So that's why we have some solutions how to go, or what to do in that case, or what we advocate for. Let's go forward then. I love that. Okay. Catchy for that. Thanks. So one of the big demands that we have as part of our respective organization, is also part of the coalition, is to kind of answer a bit on this lack of quality of investment. So there should be a higher focus on what do we spend the money on? And there we have three main demands. So one is the do no significant harm principle that was also already implemented or was already part of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, should actually be the cornerstone of the investments and reforms of the fiscal and structural plans that the member states put forward. So because for us, it's simply not okay, or not okay is even too mildly said, but it's not acceptable that we support investments and reforms that actually harm future generations, but also our planet. So I think also all the harmful subsidies that the money that governments still spend is a huge problem, and should also be more made public, in my opinion. And then the last point, or the third point here, and I said it already before, what we say is, okay, because the Commission talks about growth enhancing investments as it's the investments that member states should put forward. So if member states can justify a slower debt reduction pathways if they actually put forward some investments and reforms. I mean, that's also what I said before. But instead of just growth enhancing investments, we say, hey, resilience enhancing investments should actually be the basis of this justification, because we do have investments that maybe don't generate growth, but just are necessary. And I think we've been through earlier in this webinar what kind of investments we're talking about. Yes. And then the second one is that we should free future-oriented spending from the constraints. So, I mean, ideally we would have treaty change, right? But if this is not possible, like what can we then actually do to create more fiscal space? And that's why we say, okay, member states should actually be allowed to submit a list of future-oriented spending to be excluded from the deficit and expenditure limits. And here we mean, again, all the investments that we need. We talked about it before. And this should be done ex ante, and ex ante means before, and also validated by the council. So, I mean, not that just everyone can come up with a wish list and maybe it's been only negotiated with the Commission. No, it should then also be validated by the council. Oh, wow, that's a very... So let's go to reforming the European semester. It's another way forward. Just quickly, the European semester is a process that takes a year. Every year we go through it, where the European Commission monitors, controls, and surveils the budgets of the member states. And it's part of the fiscal framework. And in time, it has grown to become also a process for member states to coordinate their economic policies, but also social policies, employment policies, in order to converge a bit better and make sure that EU priorities are being followed and that our common targets are being met. And so what we are suggesting is to reform the European semester to include ecological, environmental indicators and processes to take all the dimensions of the economy into account, and not only the public debt figures, right? So that's why I think this slide is a bit too wordy, so I'll try to go through it quickly. But so that's why we say country-specific recommendations should take EU objectives into account. So that's basically, for example, the paths that were agreed in Paris in 2021 at the COP. Those are targets that we all want to reach. Include in this semester energy and climate governance. So how are we phasing out harmful subsidies, improving the quality of public finance, etc. And the last point is the social imbalance procedure. And this idea is very important because something that has us worried on this topic is that we're saying we need to invest a lot in environmental and climate crisis change, etc. But there's a risk that this money come from the social spending, the welfare state that we need to cherish as well. So why we're also considering that we need a social imbalance procedure to complement and improve the framework and make sure that we are coordinating our macroeconomic policy, but also our social policy. And another idea, but that's a bit our pet project, is to create an excessive emissions procedure. So today, the European Union and the European institutions have a macroeconomic imbalance procedure. They have an excessive deficit procedure. There's also an excessive debt procedure. There's procedures when member states deviate from paths that have been agreed on for public debt, public deficit, and macroeconomic indicators. And what we're saying is, greenhouse gas emissions are jeopardizing our future. They are making us take big risks, and they should be a part of this economic surveillance and monitoring process as well. So let's just add an excessive emissions procedure. And when a member state deviates from the path that was agreed to get to 1.5 degrees of global warming, then we have sanctions and coercion, the same way that we've been describing in the economic governance framework that we have. There's tons of indicators that can be included in this process, but basically the idea would be let's keep the debt sustainability analysis things, etc., but let's also include into this process, into the European semester, into the economic governance framework, environmental climate indicators.
Thanks, Thomas. And I saw also like a comment from Climate and Company, and I think one of your colleagues is also part of our Fiscal Matters Coalition, and I think they already, you guys do a lot of good stuff on the EU semester reform, because also actually, to be honest, quite a complex framework as well. So it's really, two complex frameworks. Another of our demands is, if the fiscal rules don't create the fiscal space that we would actually need, and also we just have to face the fact that member states have different debt situations and also different abilities to get new money, for example, on the market. What we then say is, then actually we would need a new central fiscal capacity. Also, the rationale behind this is problems such as the climate crisis are across borders, and also require joint action. And also Europe does actually made pledges, right? It's like to tackle the climate crisis. And as some member states have more financial capacities than others, I think it's also a climate justice issues in the end. So southern countries will probably hardest hit from climate change, so they should also get the financial support to then adapt to measures. And then, we believe that a permanent EU fiscal capacity could facilitate joint action. We're also not the only ones that say this. Actually, the IMF and other big institutions in their papers on how we could reform the fiscal rules were saying the same things. And also what you increasingly hear now, actually even concrete names for such a capacity. So, I mean, there's a Just Transition Fund. It's a bit... I think a bit tricky because there's already another Just Transition Fund, but you can call it Just Transformation Fund, etc. And then as we still have the Next Generation EU, like the common borrowing we did to fight COVID, there also talks, okay, if this is like done and in a few years, something should come afterwards. And this could, for example, follow that. Of course, also coming with certain conditions. I mean, there will be then the devil in the detail, what that would look like.
And if you like devils and details, webinar 3 will
Yes.
be all about that.
Then another important thing, I mean, yes, we need to reform the fiscal rules, we need more fiscal space, but I think what we also always want to highlight is, of course, need to go hand in hand with progressive taxation. So environmental taxes are hugely unutilized in the European Union. As some of you were in the first webinar and you remember, like, I think only 9% of revenues come from environmental taxes. So a lot more can be done. We also need to shift from labor taxes to environmental and capital tax. Labor is hugely taxed in loads of member states and capital not, which also kind of lead a bit to a preference to capital instead of labor. So, for example, a lot of businesses have then maybe an incentive, to cut down labor to save costs and then maybe invest in other things. We need taxes on unsustainable consumption. So here I'm also thinking about ending fossil fuel subsidies, but there are also all kinds of other taxes that we can think about. A very prominent idea is also a financial transaction tax. Also, that should come together with closed tax havens. I think there's also huge numbers of how much money you loses every year due to tax avoidance. And I think for me personally, also increasingly more important are wealth and inheritance taxes, because also if you look in Europe and if we actually look who produces emission and who not, I mean, the rich have a disproportionate impact on emissions, private jets, etc. So, and I think we really need to have a tax reform here as well.
Thanks, Kati. It's crazy how on time we are.
Okay.
If you want to, I think
yes.
that one's our last one.
Yeah, I think the last two ones are also just two new ideas that should also go hand in hand with fiscal space. So one is a job guarantee scheme. So the idea is that the government is the employer of last resort. So everyone who's ready and willing to able to work will get a job. And the exciting thing about this is that it could really be channeled. I mean, we don't want to talk about like just any job, but challenge towards jobs that actually contribute to social and environmental well-being. And this could be, for example, covered by taxation or borrowing. And then the other one are universal basic services or universal basic income. UBI, you probably all heard about it, guarantees everyone a minimum paid income regardless of the situation. And this could then also free time for people to adopt more sustainable lifestyles, but also for their mental health. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons. And then the UBS guarantees everyone access to basic public services. I mean, all things we care about, education, housing. I mean, the housing market also got insanely crazy and it's increasingly difficult for people to find decent housing, but also healthcare, free public transport, etc. And here again, I mean, it could be covered by taxation or borrowing. So I think these are just also two ideas that are kind of linked to the wider or the bigger picture.
Thanks for watching. See you at our next and last webinar in this series that will focus more on how you can do your own advocacy towards EU policymakers or member state policymakers. We'll be updating you on where the policy process is at, what the economic governance review looks like, and what demands you can help us push through.